This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, tonight we're going to talk about a book, mostly about the book, in the first year of the Revolution. And I hope that you find as much about this of interest as I have, because there's a lot in here I did not know as I started reading this book. The name of the book is The British Are Coming. It's written by a man named Rick Atkinson. He's a historian. He wrote the trilogy about the Second World War. This is his third Pulitzer Prize. He's a very, very highly thought of historian. And he writes a little bit differently from most historians. What he likes to do is go back and get contemporary information. So he goes back to the War Department or wherever you go in Washington. And he did this even for the Revolution. So much of what is in the book is contemporary writing, and some of it is a little bit over the top, but by and large, he winds up presenting a very interesting picture of a period in history. And tonight I'm only going to talk about 1 year, 1775. I want to start with the prelude to our revolution. The prelude was what was called in the United States, or in the colonies, the French and Indian War. And it was actually fought between British America and New France. There were military units there from the parent countries, but it was between British America and New France. And both of them had Native American allies. The French colonies had a very small population, actually, only about 60,000 people. And by 1754, there were 2 million people living in the British colonies. So the French in particular depended on the natives. Now, the French were defeated, and they weren't just defeated here in this country, they were also defeated in the 7 Years' War, which took place in Europe. They ceded all of Canada with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And this is important, and I did not realize this at all. When they ceded their territory east and west of the Mississippi to Great Britain, that wound up becoming a problem for the American colonies. Now, the war had 3 main outcomes. First of all, it opened up the colonial West for expansion. At the time, the colonies were all along the eastern seaboard, and by this conquest in here, this was now opened up to the colonies. However, it left Great Britain with a substantial financial debt, and that financial debt is one of the problems. And then finally, it left the French as mortal enemies of Great Britain, and that would come back to haunt them. I want to talk about the King of England at the time. This, by the way, was what has been shown in the movies as Mad King George, but that happened much later in his life. He was King of Great Britain. Yes, he was King of Great Britain and Ireland from 1760 until his death in 1820. So he was king for 60 years. There was a parliament by then, and the parliament had some authority over what kinds of choices were being made by the government, but he was a very autocratic king. He was no figurehead. He was presiding over a country that seemed all powerful. By winning the 7 Years' War, Great Britain was the dominant country in Europe. But financially, it was somewhat in disarray because of the wars. He saw the colonists as being an unruly mob, and they needed to be taught a lesson, especially following the Boston Tea Party. And what you might not know about the Boston Tea Party is That came about because British Parliament enacted a tax on all non-English teas. And they were doing that so that they could bail out the East India Company and make the East India Company, who was producing most of the tea that came to our country, and it closed off all other tea suppliers to the United States, or at that time the colonies. That's what they were mad about. They were used to getting cheaper tea, and now the only tea they could get was East India Company tea. He also became obsessed with defeating them. He had never met them. It was in a land he had never seen. He saw it as the first domino. He saw that if those colonies got away from Great Britain, they would be followed by other colonies in the English Empire. And he absolutely was determined not to let that happen. In August of 1775, he issued something called the Proclamation of Rebellion. The war was official. At that time, there were approximately 10,000 English troops in the colonies. Most of them were either in Boston or New York. And one of the things that the colonists were up in arms about was something called the Quartering Act, which said that the English had the right to quarter those 10,000 troops in colonial homes with no compensation. Now, the next person that you may have heard of, and I did not really understand this at all, was the Prime Minister. His name was Lord North. He was Prime Minister from 1770 until 1782. Before that, he had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, and his skills were in working with Parliament. He was not a dominant leader as much as he was a skilled politician. He became Prime Minister, and this is interesting because of how well he dealt with something called the Falkland Crisis of the 18th century. Remember the Falkland Crisis of the 20th century? Same group of characters, same problem, same results. Now, after the Boston Tea Party, he implemented a number of legislations, really at the behest of the king, called the Coercive Acts. And those Coercive Acts, as I said, included the quartering one. They took away from the colonists a certain number of rights that they had to self-government. Those were implemented in 1774. He underestimated the colonists. And so what he did was he kind of mixed conciliation. He knew they were unhappy. He had some consideration for changing or moderating what he was doing. But then at the same time, he had this king wanting severity, and that's what the acts looked like to the colonists. He was half-hearted about the war. He really did not want to be fighting another war in North America. He was easily depressed by his reverses. He often wound up defending the war that he never thought was a good idea. He thought it was a hopeless mess. Sound a little bit like Vietnam? His vacillating leadership contributed to the loss of the colonies. He was not as strong about what he did and didn't do as the king was. Now, the first Continental Congress, remember those intolerable acts? The first Continental Congress then met with delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies later on in 1774. There was one colony that did not participate. That was Georgia. Georgia did not want to agree with and see what they could do as a concerted effort against the crown. The people at that first Congress were elected by the people of the colonies, either by their legislature or by something called a committee of correspondence. So by that time, there was a fair amount of dissatisfaction throughout the colonies. The First Continental Congress met to discuss what to do. By then, by the way, Boston was blockaded and the Intolerable Acts. And what they did was they pledged an economic boycott on British trade. They sent a petition to the king. They wanted those intolerable acts repealed. The First Continental Congress, now this was 1774, remember, this was before there was bloodshed other than the Boston Massacre, but they were a key step in the disaffection with Great Britain. Interestingly, now this is back to the First Continental Congress, they invited the French Canadians to join the Congress. More about that later. In 1774, unbeknownst to the colonists, British Parliament passed something called the Quebec Act. First of all, it guaranteed religious freedom for Roman Catholics, and it restored French civil law in the conquered colony of Quebec. And if you look at that map and see what Quebec was at that time, Quebec came all the way down into the Midwest, came as far south really as Kentucky. That was Quebec in 1774. It enlarged Quebec's territory to include the unsettled lands of the Ohio Valley. And that was a problem for the colonists, because this constrained the desires of Americans such as George Washington to expand the colonies westward. Colonial speculators were already selling land in this area when this act was passed. The frustrations in this country about the Quebec Act broke into open war at Lexington on 19 April 1775. At that time, they also then formed the Second Continental Congress, and the decision was made at that time to invade Quebec. Okay, they wanted to make Quebec the 14th colony. I had never heard that before. That was their purpose in invading Quebec. The revolt, why did it happen where it happened? Boston was the hotbed of colonial disaffection. The Sons of Liberty were formed there, and I'm going to talk some more about the Sons of Liberty. John Hancock, who was a rabble-rouser, was there. Samuel Adams, who was another rabble-rouser, was there. And then last and not least, Paul Revere, who was a merchant with an axe to grind, was there. So what you had in Boston was a tinderbox, and what you had in those three people in particular were lit matches. That's where the revolt started. Who were the Sons of Liberty? They were a revolutionary organization founded all the way back in 1765 by Samuel Adams, this fellow here. Its purpose was to fight unfair taxation in the colonies. Quickly, it spread to these other colonies, New York, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, etc., all the way down into Virginia, but not into the Carolinas. They organized, this is what the Sons of Liberty did, and they led the Boston Tea Party. Samuel Adams, this man here, is credited with steering the Second Continental Congress towards independence. He was the flamethrower. Hancock was a protege of Adams. He was also a strong leader of resistance effort, and he was the president of the Second Continental Congress. Now I'm going to take a Jerry deep dive into a subject that everybody knows a great deal about, gunpowder. Availability of gunpowder was a problem for the colonial army from start to finish. There was never enough gunpowder to meet their needs throughout the entire revolution. 90% of the gunpowder that the revolutionary colonial army used came from the French, primarily shipped through their colonies in the West Indies. Had we not had the French from the very beginning, the revolution would have been stillborn. At the time of the war, there were only 3 powder mills in the entire 13 colonies. There are 3 ingredients that go into making gunpowder: saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate, sulfur, and charcoal. Of the 3, saltpeter is the most difficult to obtain. It's found in caves. It's found in bat guano. There's saltpeter over in the Nickajack caves. And it's found in tobacco refuge. It's found in any area where there's a decomposition of organic material over time. However, the British also suffered from limitations on gunpowder. Remember, they had to ship their gunpowder 3,000 miles across the ocean. Washington commissioned 2 privateers to intercept the British supply of gunpowder, and that's where some of his gunpowder came from. These privateers had a very specific mission: interdict the supply of munitions and gunpowder. By 76, the French were totally supplying the colonists. And remember what I said earlier, they had their own agenda. Lexington and Concord. Following the Tea Party and the Quartering Act, there was turmoil in Boston. Massachusetts evicted its governor. He wound up in Boston. His name was Gates. He was a general. The Provisional Council was formed and they demanded redress, and they started armed militia forces all over Massachusetts and other places, but in particular at Massachusetts. Gage sent 800 men from here in Boston towards Lexington and Concord to confiscate weapons that spies told him were there, also gunpowder, and at the same time he hoped to capture some Patriot leaders. The 2 I talked about earlier, Adams and Hancock. If you'll remember, that's where Paul Revere made his ride to inform the colonists that the British were coming, 1 if by sea and 2 if by land, I think. On April 19th, there was a skirmish in Lexington. In Lexington, a few casualties occurred, mostly militia. In Lexington, the militia broke and ran. They proceeded on the same day to Concord, which is, less than 5 miles away. And they got to this river here at North Bridge and found on the far side of it 3,000 militia. The British actually ran into them. These were British troops, but they had never been in battle before. So it wasn't like this was a well-trained, well-skilled army. This was British recruits. The British suffered pretty serious casualties here at North Bridge, and they started to withdraw. It was a disaster. As the Brits came back down the way they came, there were militia on all sides of them the entire way back. They then sent a reinforcement unit out from Boston to help them, and it only got worse. It was a severe thrashing of the British forces. Taking another Jerry deep dive. How much do you know about smallpox? I didn't know very much about it at all. It's an infectious disease caused by one of two viruses. During outbreaks in the early part of the colonial experience in the Native American populations, fatality rates were as high as 80 to 90%. It is a deadly disease. By 1776, half of the colonial soldiers who were stationed around Quebec, and I'm going to talk about what was going on in Quebec, had smallpox. After the siege at Boston, it was a major problem in both armies. Smallpox was the measles of the later wars that the United States fought in. Vaccinations were starting, but they were crude. And if you read about the way they vaccinated them, you would cringe. They would take infected material from someone who had smallpox and cut themselves and place it in the cuts. That was their way of vaccinating. Later in the war, from what I have read, vaccination is what saved Washington's army at Valley Forge. Now, Breed's Hill. Some of you probably know about Breed's Hill as the Battle of Bunker Hill. But the militia, by now surrounding Boston, there were 15,000 militia around Boston and less than 10,000 British inside the city, came down this peninsula, and their intention was to fortify Bunker Hill. Okay, that's this hill here. However, they either in error or thought it was a better idea, they fortified Breed's Hill, which is here. 2,200 British regulars attacked them. It's a high enough hill that being on top of the hill, you do a whole lot better than those down below. They were repulsed twice, but then with reinforcements, they continued the assault and they carried the hill. They included a flanking attack around Breed's Hill, coming this way, which then forced the total evacuation of this peninsula. The militia then withdrew. In this battle, the British suffered more than 1,000 casualties, the militia less than 500. The town of Charlestown, that's this little town here, was totally destroyed in the fighting. And that's one of the things that I'm picking up out of this book, is there were a number of communities, and not all of them small, that were destroyed in the war. However, because of the battle at Breed's Hill, because then what they did was they fortified right here at the neck of the peninsula. The British were bottled up in Boston. They were stuck in Boston and in this peninsula. And there were forays out from then on, but never really a serious effort to break out. I thought you might be interested in this. Who were the Loyalists? Approximately 500,000 out of a population of over 3 million remained faithful to the crown. These people, and think about this for a little while, these people were law and order oriented. They were abhorrent of civil disobedience. And that's what was going on, civil disobedience. So they supported the mother country. Another thing that people think is that the Loyalists were all the upper class and the rich. They came from all strata of society. In fact, there were votes taken of how many, whether or not to send a legation to the Continental Congress, and out of, say, 800 people who could vote, 200 or 300 in an area on Long Island voted not to. However, once Continental Congress was running the country, the Loyalist weapons were confiscated and many were imprisoned without trial, without any form of a legal action. Mobs in New York Now, these are patriot mobs were roaming the streets of the city, destroying Loyalist property. Loyalty oaths were required by the patriots. So if you were a Loyalist and somebody knew that you were, they would come to you and say, we're going to confiscate your guns. And if you don't take a loyalty oath, you're going to be put on a list and you're liable to be put in jail. As a result, many of the Loyalists actually fought with the British forces, and I was not able to find out how many. Now, I want to introduce you to two people that you might have never heard of, the Howe Brothers. General Sir William Howe was the commander of all British forces during the Revolution. He replaced Gage as commander. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He had taken part in many of the conflicts campaigns in Canada, and he commanded the British forces in Boston during the siege. At that time, there were somewhere around 5,000 to 7,000 British troops in Boston. In the years after the war, Howe and his brother, who was an admiral, I'll talk about him in a second, were sympathetic to the concerns of the colonists. Howe was not in favor of the war. Admiral of the Fleet Richard Howe was a British naval officer. He had gained his reputation for his role in amphibious operations against the French during the 7 Years' War. In America, he was known for his service during the Revolution. He was the naval commander in America. He was also a peace commissioner. So the next year, they made a peace overture to the Continental Congress. And when I talk about 1776, next time I do this, I'll talk a little bit about that peace commission. Next, I want to talk about Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga is a fort at the confluence of Lake Champlain and Lake George. It controlled access north and south between Albany and Montreal. To get from Albany to Montreal, you went up Lake George, then you went up Lake Champlain, and Ticonderoga was at the southern end of Lake Champlain. It had been important. It had been important during the French and Indian War, but by 1775 it was a minor garrison and had fallen into disrepair. In May of 1775, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys rode across Lake Champlain from Vermont and captured the fort in a late night surprise attack. A vast amount, this is a good sized fort, okay? A vast amount of artillery fell into American hands. This is in May of 75 at Ticonderoga. In late 75, George Washington sent Henry Knox to gather that artillery and bring it to Boston. Who was Henry Knox? He was an officer of the Continental Army. He also served after the war as Secretary of War. He was also pretty overweight. He was a pretty smart politician. As the revolution began, he befriended Washington. He soon became the chief artillery officer of the entire Continental Army. And the Continental Army, by the way, was the army that was at Boston. There wasn't any other army at that time to speak of. As the siege wore on, those cannon that had been captured at Ticonderoga seemed to be just a plum waiting to be picked. And Washington put him in charge of an expedition to retrieve them. And if you want to read a fascinating story, read the story of bringing 60 tons of cannon and other armaments from Ticonderoga across the entire state of Connecticut and Massachusetts to Boston in the winter. These cannon would end the siege, and he served with distinction going forward from there. The Second Continental Congress, it convened in May of 1775 after Lexington and Concord. Again, there were just 12 of the 13 colonies represented. On June the 14th, they voted to create the Continental Army using various militia units, and they appointed George Washington as commanding general. Supposedly, Washington came to the meeting of the Second Continental Congress dressed in his uniform. He could have had a sign. He could have had a sign on his chest that said, "I'm ready anytime you guys are." But the first thing that they did was they decided to issue an olive branch petition on July the 5th. That was one last attempt to avoid war with Great Britain. However, the olive branch petition was issued a month after they had authorized the invasion of Canada. They had no legal authority to govern, but they assumed the functions of any national government. They sent ambassadors to Europe. They made treaties. They raised army. They obtained loans. They issued paper money. They dispersed funds. They were the Second Continental Congress, for better or for worse, is what ran the revolution. On June the 7th, Richard Henry Lee offered a resolution to declare independence. A month later, the Declaration of Independence was.
Hey, George.
Yeah.
Can I ask, how did England feel about this Congress? Was it?
They were rebels and they should be hung.
But so it wasn't sanctioned. They were doing this all underground, more or less.
They weren't underground. They were doing it though against the express wishes of the Crown and the British Parliament. They were not authorized to do any of what they were doing. When I talk about 1776, and that'll be the next time, I'm going to talk about where were all the governors of all these colonies. But they were rebels. Remember what someone said, we can either hang separately. No, we either all hang together. We need to hang together or else we'll all hang separately.
Yep.
That's what that was about. They were committing treason, and they would have been hung had the British won the war.
George, I was told about the British soldiers by King George III didn't think too much of sending his elite force over in the beginning, and sent a lot of soldiers who really didn't have combat action, and that's why that's why some of the skirmishes, the militia turned away a lot of these British soldiers. Is that correct or what? That was my understanding.
The troops that were in the colonies when it started were not skilled, experienced troops. When they started sending armies from England, that was a different story. But
yes.
England has never had a large standing army. England has always been, the strength of England has always been their navy.
Yeah.
That's why they had to wind up hiring so many German Hessians. They did not have that big an army. Okay, the invasion of Canada. Remember I said the colonists were already selling land in the Ohio Valley. June 27th, they authorized a general named Philip Schuyler, if it seemed appropriate, to begin an invasion. And where he was down here at south of Lake George at Ticonderoga. If it seemed appropriate to begin an invasion, he decided it was appropriate. At the same time, over here in Boston, Benedict Arnold convinced Washington to authorize a second invasion. And this was going to be Arnold's route of advance. He was going up the coast then up through Maine directly to Quebec. Initially, the Western effort was successful. They easily captured Fort St. John's and Montreal, and at the time, Montreal evidently was a very small town. However, Arnold's route and his progress was much slower and much more arduous, and you need to read the book to get a flavor for what this was like in the summer and fall and early winter of '75. It was an awful, awful trip. However, the two armies, they were both small now. They were, I think Arnold had something like 12 or 1,500 men, and Montgomery was actually leading this force. Schuyler was overall in charge. He had a general named Montgomery leading it. His force was about the same, but there weren't that many British soldiers in Quebec. They met at Quebec City late in the fall, just as the winter was setting in, and they invested the citadel. Quebec City was a walled city. It was a fort. On New Year's Eve, this combined colonial force attacked, and they were bloodily repulsed. In fact, Montgomery was killed, and Arnold was badly wounded. The siege continued, but for all intents and purposes, it was over. And later on, the entire army retreated back up the St. Lawrence and back down towards the south. Who was Benedict Arnold? And he's got a bad name, and I'm not going to say he doesn't deserve it, but he's an interesting person to read about. He was an American general, and he served with distinction during the Revolution, all the way up until the time he turned traitor. Before the Revolution, he was a very successful businessman. When the Revolution began, he joined the Connecticut militia. He went to the siege at Boston. He participated with Ethan Allen in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. When they authorized the invasion of Canada, he personally talked Washington into sending that secondary force north towards Quebec City on the second route. How he did that, I have not ever read. His leg was shattered at the Battle of Quebec, but he stayed at Quebec. Remember, Montgomery, the other general, was killed. He remained in charge of the siege until it ended. He was promoted there, and much would follow in his career. And next time when I talk about '76, you'll hear a lot more about what Arnold did. He continued to be a hero of the Revolution. The siege of Boston from May of '75 to March of '76. After their victory at Breed's Hill, the British Army was now bottled up, as I said before, in Boston. Continental forces, as many as 20,000 men, ringed the city of Boston. Kind of like Bragg had Chattanooga surrounded. The British still had the sea. The Navy was somewhat free to come and go, although there were American privateers and small American interdictions. In July, Washington arrived and took charge of the now established Continental Army. The siege was long and it only had minor skirmishes. The British were content to stay in Boston, and food and supplies became the issue. Both armies lacked the food and the materiel to change the situation. The colonials could not attack the city, and the British could not break out. Now, that winter, as I said before, Knox then brought 60 tons of military supplies from Ticonderoga, and in particular, what he brought was heavy cannon. Another sidebar just for entertainment. You ever heard of Falmouth, Maine? You will not have heard of it because it no longer exists. But 4 British warships besieged this seaport. It's 100 miles north of Boston in October. What they were doing, these are the ships here off the coast of Falmouth, is they were foraging for masting for ships. Masts did not last forever on these ships, and they needed the big timber to keep their ships in good condition. The rebels who were here in the town resisted their efforts. A number of threats were made. The British seaman in charge of this fleet said, "You have 1 day to either change your attitude or I'm going to open fire." The following day, they were bombarded for 9 hours by a frigate, and the entire town was set afire. And this was not a small town. There were 2,000 people living in this community. The burning left 3/4 of the town in ashes, and its citizenry committed to independence. And this was only one of many small communities who were caught in the revolution and destroyed. Remember, I told you about Charlestown outside of Boston. It was also destroyed, and there are others. Dorchester Heights. Following the arrival of the cannon and powder, Washington planned to attack the city. On March the 4th, 6,000 troops from the Continental Army, this is where Dorchester Heights is, overlooking Boston Harbor and the city. It's a series of hills with a commanding view of Boston and its harbor. They occupied Dorchester Heights with their cannons. It threatened the city and it threatened naval ships in the harbor. And Howe, remember him, commander of the British forces, he decided to attack them from the city. However, a snowstorm prevented its execution. So instead, the British forces evacuated the city on March the 17th and sailed to Halifax. The Continental Army occupied Boston and never gave it up. Close of 75. The Colonial Revolution, our Colonial Revolution, was the first and only successful effort to sever ties with the empire until the 20th century. Think about that. We were the only ones who did it, and our motivations, even now, are somewhat murky. It was more of an extension of the 7 Years' War than it was the product of tyrannical despotism, although that was part of it. English arrogance played a major role in their downfall. Parliament enacted a series of laws that were blatantly what we would call unconstitutional. British citizens, that's what we were, had a right to representation, and they had none. They could have backed down somehow. Logistically, it was a nightmare for both sides. As you read all of the contemporary accounts from people and what was happening with food and clothing. Remember, it was winter now in Boston. It was awful. Gunpowder was just one of the shortfalls. The first year of the conflict demonstrated how difficult this war was going to be. Boston was a success, but it wasn't one that was soon to be followed. The colonials at the end of 75 were still at Quebec City, but they were not going to be there long. And thus ends the program. Questions?
Hey, George, one thing that really impressed me when I started reading that book was that the Revolutionary War was about 8 years long. I've always thought of it as being a 1 or 2 years war, but it lasted for about 8 years.
It really did. And we, even though were successful at Yorktown, we not so much won the war as the British got tired of it. We outlasted them. the logistics of sending all these troops, but really supplying them, the cost of it was a bad economic decision.
George, did you read in this book or in your research how many officers actually came from the U.S. that had military experience? Didn't most of the officers come from France?
No, not initially. Not initially. Initially, they were just colonists. They had some experience in the French and Indian War. A few of them did.
Yeah.
Most of them were just frontiersmen. They were not skilled, trained soldiers. I mean, Washington was the one with the most, and Washington did terribly in the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
That's why the British thought that there would be an easy mark. They thought that they could just walk over us.
An interesting
Well,
fact
you're
that
you're probably right, George, except for one thing. The French helped us out tremendously. If it wasn't for France, we probably wouldn't be, it would be very interesting to see what would happen.
We would never have been successful without the French. There's
Yep.
no doubt of that.
Absolutely.
last
They
year
fought
when
an
I was
army and a navy.
last year when I was in Montreal, we visited the governor's mansion, which is across the street from City Hall, and it was built by the French, and a Frenchman was still the governor in the spring of 1775. Benjamin Franklin, because he spoke French, was sent up there to convince the Canadians to join in with
Yes,
the
he
American
was.
Revolution and stayed for 90 days.
Right.
There is still there's a DAR certificate on the wall of the governor's mansion
Is that right?
commemorating that event, which blew my mind. And also, George, on your map, it said Portsmouth, Maine, but at that time, that was still part of Massachusetts.
Correct.
That
was
that
correct.
part was a colony of Massachusetts.
Yep, that is correct. So it is now
But-
Portsmouth, Maine. That's because that's how I decided to label it, Owen. But you're
I
right.
understand,
In fact, when you
but
try to look it up in reference books, you see different names associated with it because it doesn't exist anymore. The
Right.
town there that was there then is now a suburb of Portsmouth.
Is it Portsmouth or Portland?
I'm sorry, it's a suburb of Portland, right?
Okay.
Did you learn anything?
yes,
Absolutely. Thank you, George.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Okay, so next 2 weeks you're going to do part 2, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Not next week.
Not next week.
No, next week I got a program.
Thank you,
It'll
Jerry.
fit. It'll fit nicely with what you're talking about here. So
Is that right?
yeah, from a different perspective. Going to be based up mostly talk about Canada.
Just as a little side note, I used to live in West Virginia a little bit. And the amazing thing is, I live in near Charlestown, West Virginia, and they also have a Bunker Hill, West Virginia, nearby. I always wonder about people taking names of other famous cities in Boston. I don't know how they got the name, but a lot of those little towns were incorporated in 1734. I know Middleway, West Virginia was incorporated in 1734.
Well, at that time, it would have been in Quebec.
Yeah, you're right.
I did not realize that Quebec, as of 1774, Quebec actually came all the way down into Kentucky.
Yeah, that's amazing. I never knew that either.
And one of the primary motivations of the attack on Canada was they had already started selling land out there that they didn't own.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, guys, have a nice
thank you,
evening.
George.